It's gotten to the point today because of the cancer, the rot inside the Democratic Party, particularly among young people and progressive base, that there is only one pro-Israel party left in America, and it's not the Democratic Party.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States, with a conversation about how the 2024 election is impacting the conflict, with author and former White House spokesman Ari Fleischer. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, by going to jns.org or Telegram and subscribing. And now to today's program. Will the 2024 presidential election be a referendum on the war on Hamas? That seems to be one of the main concerns in the Biden White House these days. And a lot of Democrats seem to agree. If you read the New York Times or the Washington Post or watch MSNBC, you've been told over and over again that Joe Biden has been a great president, that the U.S. economy is booming, that the open border doesn't mean anything, and that the world has become safer since he took over from Donald Trump, and that anyone who doesn't agree with all of this is a deranged supporter of misinformation and authoritarianism. But their problem is not only that those who believe all of this are living in a left-wing bubble, they are also setting themselves up for a colossal disappointment. While a lot can change in the next 8 months, the polls show that most Americans disagree about Biden. He has the sort of approval numbers, lower than those of Jimmy Carter in 1980, George H.W. Bush in 1992, and Donald Trump in 2020, that normally guarantees the defeat of an incumbent. And he's trailing Trump in head-to-head national polls and in most battleground states. So what does a candidate in that kind of hot water do? The answer is obvious. Look for what factors that are causing you problems and try to change the public's mind. But unfortunately for Biden, he's listening to the wrong advice. His inner circle is supposed to be made up of centrists who promised Americans both a return to normalcy and an alternative to radical left-wingers in 2020. But in many respects, Biden has governed as if he was Bernie Sanders. The one clear exception was his reaction to the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel, when he articulated a policy of strong support for the Jewish state and for the eradication of the terrorists. But while that is a stance that is still supported by most Americans, it's very unpopular with the left-wing base of the Democratic Party that has been indoctrinated in woke ideologies that falsely smear Israel as a white oppressor and an apartheid state. The civil war within the Democratic Party, as active as balk at supporting Genocide Joe, speaks volumes about how far left the Democratic Party has shifted in recent years, and it has convinced Biden and his team that his support for Israel is politically unpopular. That has resulted in a steady shift in administration policy towards Israel, with Biden and his advisors now often repeating Hamas lies about Israeli attacks on Hamas targets in Gaza being indiscriminate or over the top. While divorced from the facts, it does indicate that the White House really does believe that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is costing him the election. As a result, in the last week, Biden has made it clear he won't tolerate the Israelis finishing off Hamas in its last stronghold in Rafah, and endorsed the call from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer for basically regime change in Jerusalem, an unconscionable and unprecedented act of interference in the domestic politics of a fellow democracy. But the problem here is that this is a faulty diagnosis of Biden's political problems. He's not losing to Trump in states like Michigan because young voters and Arab Americans hate Israel, but because working-class Americans, including minorities like Hispanics and African Americans, believe he's betrayed them. He's set up to lose in November because of failed policies on the economy and illegal immigration, as well as the general perception of American weakness abroad that led to disaster in Afghanistan and wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. Making Israel the scapegoat for his troubles is perilous for Israel since it needs American arms and ammunition to continue fighting Hamas and to confront threats from Hezbollah and Iran. But it won't re-elect Biden since not only does this not address his real weaknesses, there are also far more votes to be lost in the pro-Israel political center than on the anti-Israel left. And unless and until he realizes this, his political problems won't be solved, even if speaking this way compromises Israel's security while the president continues to flail for answers. To discuss all this and the way the 2024 election and its coverage impacts the Jewish community, we're happy to have back with us today a friend of the program and one of the smartest analysts of American politics. Ari Fleischer was President George W. Bush's press secretary and is the author of a memoir of his time in the cauldron of the White House called Taking Heat. Since then, he's become the head of his own communications firm, where he advises figures in the corporate world and in sports, as well as appearing on Fox News as a contributor. He was also the author of the 2022 book, Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias, Why the Press Gets So Much Wrong and Doesn't Care. Ari Fleischer, welcome back to Top Story.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, Ari, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about whether recent events have finally put to rest the idea that there is still a bipartisan pro-Israel consensus. I can recall back when your old boss, George W. Bush, was running for re-election in 2004, and the GOP was asking for Jewish votes on the basis of his support for Israel. And Democrats said that was wrong because even raising the question of which party was better for the Jewish state would undermine the consensus. But at a time when even supposed pro-Israel Democrats like Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer are essentially accusing Israel of committing war crimes in Gaza and seeking to stop it from eliminating Hamas, is it now clear that there really is a partisan divide over Israel?
There's been a partisan divide for decades, I'm afraid to say, when it comes to Israel, and it's gotten to the point today because of the cancer, the rot inside the Democratic Party, particularly among young people and progressive base, that there's only one pro-Israel party left in America, and it's not the Democratic Party.
Right.
This has been a 20-year crumbling of Democratic support for Israel, and it culminated in Senator Schumer's speech.
Yeah, I think a lot of pro-Israel voters have assumed that the problem among the Democrats was limited to the far left, the Squad, the progressives, or, even Bernie Sanders. But why do you think the centrists, like Schumer, and we can certainly discuss his cynicism, even dating back to the Iran deal and other issues, as well as Biden, why have they shifted on Israel? Can it really be that they really think that Israelis agree with them about stopping the war on Hamas or rewarding the Palestinians for terrorism of October 7th with the state? Or is it just their belief that support for Israel is costing them the election? And if so, why do they believe something that, at least to me, appears so clearly illogical?
Well, as the Wall Street Journal put it, from Joe Biden's point of view, he's for a two-state solution, and the two states are Michigan and Nevada. The two states he thinks he's going to lose because of the vote against him in the Arab community. I thought that was pretty clever by the Wall Street Journal. Look, I remember 20 years ago going to the Israeli Foreign Ministry in Jerusalem and warning Mark Regev. And I said to him, The Democratic Party is where you need to focus your energy. You've got Republicans. In America today, if you care about Israel and you're Jewish, you're voting Republican. But there's an erosion that has started to take place inside the Democratic Party, and you need to address it because the Democrats are walking away. And I remember during the Hezbollah war, I think it was 2007, a shooting war between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and the Wall Street Journal took a poll, and it showed that the Democrats were 50-50 on who do their sympathies lie with, Israel or the Palestinians. And I was amazed that it could be 50-50 in the middle of a war with Hezbollah. And it's only eroded and gotten worse since then. Barack Obama did Israel no favors. Barack Obama put in distance between Israel and the United States, the way he would talk down to Israeli leaders. It all sent a signal to the Democratic base that it's okay to break from Israel. Along comes J Street. This has been a long time coming. And what really has done it for the Democrats is their belief that Israel is an oppressor country, that it's an apartheid state, it should be boycotted. This has become mainstream Democratic thinking about Israel, and it's pernicious. But it is what it is to be a modern-day Democrat when you look at Israel.
I think that's very true. It's not even so much, certainly Netanyahu is always a figure of controversy, but it's really a fundamental question about the United States and about what Americans think that is influencing this, because the rise of critical race theory, intersectionality, which, I think many American Jews, certainly who were Democrats, thought that these were just, Republican culture war talking points. But I think since October 7th, they've begun to understand that this is about something much more fundamental than, ideas about, their ideas about race. This is about how you think about Western civilization, how you think about the Jews. And the Jews clearly are the canary in the coal mine when it comes to these toxic ideas, aren't they?
And it's one of the most misguided beliefs I can ever imagine. I typically never will challenge the motives of those who don't have a belief like mine. I respect them. I think they're doing it for good reason, good cause almost always. But in this instance, I've got to just say, the idea that Israel, the home, the democracy in the Middle East, the home to 2 million Arabs who vote, who have more civil rights in Israel than they would in any Arab nation you can name, the gay community in Tel Aviv, the life that Israel has is a vibrant Western life. And you have these young Westerners, Democrats, who think that Israel should be the pariah state. You have people, gay groups, protesting for Hamas.
Yeah, Queers for Palestine.
Of course, they would be shot and thrown off of a building if they ever practiced their homosexuality in an Arab country, especially Hamas. And yet they say Israel is the nation that needs to modify and change its behavior. It's just a lost cause, a lost generation. They've lost their way. If they can look at Israel and think Israel is the nation that's done something wrong, Israel is the nation that's done so much right.
Yeah, well, let's drill down a little bit on some of the recent events. The Schumer speech, obviously, he's always been about politics. Everybody understands that, and that his shtick about being the Shomer of Israel was not only linguistically questionable, but, not really true. But even so, that was a very shocking event to have, the highest ranking Jewish, politician in this country basically echoing some of the smears against Israel and calling basically for regime change in Jerusalem. What do you think was his motivation? Was it all about politics, or is there something else at work here?
I think it was two parts. I think one, he wanted to clear the ice, the snow in front of Joe Biden. He wanted to give Biden room and flexibility for Biden to win back the Democratic vote. And he knew Biden couldn't do it. Biden's not strong enough to do it. Biden equivocates. So Schumer stepped forward to do it for Joe Biden. Secondly, this is what I was alluded to earlier, when there's a cancer inside the Democratic Party. When so many Democrats no longer are the older Jewish Democrats who support Israel, that starts to erode the ability of politicians to stay strongly for Israel, because now they're taking on their vociferous growing base. So you add in the Democrat fear of Biden losing the election because of the Arab vote in Michigan and Nevada. And then you couple that with the erosion of liberal Democrats, progressive Democrats, young Democrats, a huge chunk of the Democratic vote. And I think that's what motivated Chuck Schumer. This is a political play. This has a lot less to do with getting humanitarian aid to the people in Gaza as it does getting political aid to the Democrats in Washington.
Yeah, and I guess that was my take as well. But I also think it's really bad political advice to be giving Joe Biden if his inner circle really believes that Arab Americans and young leftists are going to cost him Michigan. If he's going to lose Michigan, and right now the polls show him losing most of the swing states, it's because of working class voters not liking his policies, because of illegal immigration, because of the economy, which, contrary to what, like you're told on MSNBC, most Americans don't think is so great, and losing Hispanics and African-American voters, yet they seem, they're using Israel as the scapegoat when their problems really aren't, about that, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, although I will point out in politics, when you're going into a close race, you fight for every coalition. And they've made the decision to fight for the Arab American coalition. And they're in politically speaking, a squeeze. And I don't like to look at it in terms of politics because this is existential. This is about life and death in Israel. But the Jewish vote in America is today about a 70-30 Democrat-Republican voting bloc. It used to be 90-10. Republicans have made considerable inroads into the Jewish community in America. Now it's 70-30. The Arab vote is an overwhelmingly Democratic vote. My bet is Joe Biden's going to alienate all sides of this. He's not going to do well in the Jewish vote. It's probably going to be a 60-40 vote this time. And the Arab vote is likely to stay at home in much larger numbers than ever they have before. So he's going to get the worst of all worlds by trying to play the politics of this. The right thing to do is just to stand by Israel. That is the right thing to do, to call for Hamas to be destroyed. And if you want to end this war fast, if you want to let the hostages get freed, let Hamas know that they have not any sympathy with the American president, that the American president wants to see this job finished. That is the best way to finish Hamas off. And then let the people of Gaza actually have a meaningful, good life, because something better will replace Hamas, which is what the people of Gaza deserve. But Biden has always had bad judgment when it comes to foreign policy. He messes these things up, and he is messing up Gaza. Look, if you go back to Ukraine, what Joe Biden did wrong in Ukraine was drag his feet, delay, deny every request Ukraine made to get weapons until it was almost too late, and then he would begrudgingly give them weapons 6-9 months, a year after they asked for them and could have made a battlefield difference. He created a quagmire. He's now going to try to do the same thing in Gaza. If Israel can't finish Hamas off, it's a quagmire. That seems to be what Joe Biden is for. This is his judgment when it comes to foreign policy.
That seemed to be the result of the Biden-Netanyahu conversation that happened a day before we're taping this, that he doesn't want Israel to go into Rafah, which means basically Hamas survives the war and basically wins it. But I think it's really interesting. I think you're right. Clearly, just if you watch the State of the Union speech, the message from there was it was all about the Democratic base. They think this is a base election. They can turn out enough of their core support that they can win. That's it. Yet, I'm not sure that that's really true because, again, he's, given the polling that shows him losing, so many votes from people that they took for granted, like Hispanics. Hispanics are not leaving Joe Biden because of, because they think he's being mean to the Palestinians or because they want Israel to lose the war. They've got their own issues.
And if he approaches this as how does he put together a winning coalition to win re-election, that in and of itself is a formula for a terrible foreign policy series of decisions he has to make. I just learned this in the White House. You either focus on foreign policy and especially military matters to get it right and win, regardless of the politics. And if you do that, you're called a leader and you'll have more followers. Or you try to let politics influence military and state and foreign policy decisions. And if you go that route, the Biden route, you're going to get your foreign policy decisions wrong. You're going to create military quagmires, and you will lose votes at home. That seems to be where Joe Biden's going.
I think it's interesting. As a rule, foreign policy doesn't tend to, impact American, certainly presidential elections. Maybe 2004, when you were still involved, that was an exception because of, post 9/11 in Iraq, Afghanistan and Iraq. But by and large, Americans tend to vote on their economy, on how they feel about the country, here, and not on what's going on abroad. Do you think foreign policy does play a big role in this election? I mean, are they right to worry that much that 100,000 voters in Dearborn, Michigan, will cost them the election? Is that going to be enough? Or, why aren't they worried about sort of centrist and pro-Israel voters? And I don't mean only Jews, and we'll get into the Jewish vote later because there's a lot for us to discuss there. But I'm not sure why they don't, sort of look at a lot of the same polls and see that they could be doing themselves a lot of harm by taking this point of view.
I think in 2024, what's at play is a sense of malaise that nothing is going right, that we know the economy is bad, we know inflation remains too high, we know the southern border is open, and then the world is just not at peace. Whether it's Ukraine, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's the Chinese buildup, there's just a sense that the world is spiraling out of control on Joe Biden's watch, which has given Donald Trump a massive opening, which he's running through, saying these things never would have happened on my watch. Indeed, they didn't happen on his watch.
Exactly.
So it allows him to check that box, which is less a foreign policy box, because you're right, people do vote more on domestic matters. But in 2024, they're also voting on just the world seems worse off than it was 4 years ago. And that's something politically that is palpable. It's a combination of domestic and foreign policy. And Biden has created this for himself. I think the right move always would have been for Joe Biden to have done what American presidents historically have done, which is just proudly support Israel and condemn terrorists, and particularly condemn rapist terrorists who take hostages and still hold hostages, including Americans. But instead, he's trying to attack and have it every which way out of mostly sensitivity to the America's Arab community. And that's what's got him in so much trouble and has got his policy sideways.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. And listen, I think if you follow tracking polls, which I know you do, the turning point for Biden in terms of favorability, unfavorability, was the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the perception of weakness and chaos and disaster. It's never really recovered since then. I mean, and he's, you speak of, you use the magic word malaise, and the truth is his polling numbers right now are worse than Jimmy Carter's were in 1980, or George H.W. Bush's in 1992, or Donald Trump's numbers, 4 years ago. And I think everybody thought that Donald Trump was in deep trouble 4 years ago. If we were to speak at that moment, Biden is in an even worse position. And there doesn't seem to be, I think, a rational approach to, why this is, if you're just going to blame it on Netanyahu. I heard James Carville, sort of a blast from the past on MSNBC the other day say that Netanyahu is costing the Democrats the election. I've got to wonder, does he really think that?
I mean, have these people never been to Israel? Have they not been to Israel post-October 7th? Do they not understand how unified the Israeli people are? Do they not understand that Israel, regardless of what party you are in, wants to destroy and will destroy Hamas? This is bigger than Bibi. And it's such an American misread of the Israeli democracy to think that they can make this about Bibi. But that's what Democrats have always tried to do. This is part of their trying to have it both ways. They don't want to criticize Israel, so they'll criticize Bibi Netanyahu and try to turn him into an American right-wing kook politician, which is what they do here in America if they meet a politician that they don't like on the conservative side. But it's not working. It's not working because Israel is unified, particularly after October 7th, to destroy Hamas, and they know that this is their mission. They know it is their moral calling. And when they do it, They will have done the United States a favor, and they will have done the world a favor. They'll also, interestingly, do many Arab nations a favor. Why do you think the Arab world is sitting there so quietly as Hamas is getting destroyed? It's because they want Israel to destroy Hamas. The only one left who seems to be trying to have it both ways is Joe Biden. The Arab world is cheering Israel to finish this job. Israelis are unified. It's just Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think that's true. Somehow he's buying, and of course we'll get to the media. I want to talk about that with you because you understand the media as well as anybody in this country. But let's turn for a moment to the other side of the spectrum. We've talked about the Democrats and how they've gone to the left, but now let's talk about the Republicans and Donald Trump. Now, clearly he's running with a record on Israel, which he wasn't 4 years ago, as the most pro-Israel president ever. But it's not unreasonable to ask whether that will stay the same, whether the influence of people like Tucker Carlson, who have been very critical of Israel, or so that particular sector of the right, small though it is, but Carlson does sometimes seem to have Trump's ear. And whether his grudge against Netanyahu for congratulating Biden for winning in 2020 will impact U.S.-Israel relations, should the two of them both still be in power next January.
Well, if you're asking me to predict what Donald Trump will do or say in the future, that's impossible. I would like to believe that based on his first term, and particularly his remarkable success with the Abraham Accords, bringing peace between several Arab nations and Israel, and the possibility now in a second term of doing that with Saudi Arabia, which I think will be a likelihood if Donald Trump is elected, which will be miraculous to have a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. In addition to his support for Israel in his first term, his moving the embassy to Jerusalem, his recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights, the way his administration, throughout the administration, supported Israel from the National Security Council to the State Department. Everywhere you look, it was a pro-Israel friendly administration. I hope that will be carried over into a second Trump term. You just don't know. And that's what's so interesting about Donald Trump. When he ran in 2016, one of the things he said that I agreed with was that Americans have been so predictable in our foreign policy that everybody can play us for fools. And he said, I'm going to be a lot less predictable in my foreign policy. As a result, I'd argue he's gotten NATO to increase its spending because they're scared to death that he will cut out and leave NATO behind. So they're finally increasing spending in NATO. Will he do something equally unpredictable with Israel and turn his back on Israel? I don't think so, Jonathan, but you never know.
Yeah, well, I think the other factor that also plays in, it's not just the unpredictability, but he has an abiding contempt for sort of the establishment, for the foreign policy establishment, the experts, the smart people, the wise men, supposed wise men, who, of course, when it comes to the Middle East, have been consistently wrong for the last 30, 40 years. And they were against all of his pro-Israel moves. And I think, he was justified in rejecting them. And in fact, that was the key to his, taking those steps, was his belief that if I listen to the experts, listen to the Tom Friedmans of the world, I'll be no different. And I think that, David Friedman wrote about it in his book, that was the deciding factor in moving the embassy. It was like, well, if you're going to listen to the establishment, you're not really Donald Trump. Obviously, the establishment is still on the other side of these issues, so I guess that's a factor, in their favor. But you're right; he's a very unpredictable person, and it has, he's also, his approach to politics and pretty much everything else is transactional.
Yeah, and that's where Bibi congratulating Joe Biden really did set Donald Trump off. This is what democracies do. They congratulate the winner, and then you work with the winner. You have no choice. But we do know that did alienate Donald Trump. I'll just tell you a very quick story. When it came to moving the embassy, all kinds of Bush predecessors, and then including George Bush, promised to move the embassy to Jerusalem. And every single time, and I sat in these briefings, the State Department would talk about the problem that will create in the streets, in the Arab streets. There'll be rioting. If you do this, there'll be... And after September 11th, George Bush's top priority was keeping an Arab coalition together as we took on Afghanistan and the fight against international terror. So that became more preeminent with Bush. He didn't want to take any chances on doing anything that could alienate the Arab community, while as much as he was a strong supporter of Israel, he listened to the experts, didn't move the embassy. I've heard those briefings. Along comes Donald Trump and just says, these experts are idiots. They don't know what they're talking about. They're wrong. And everybody in the State Department said to Donald Trump and to his top advisors, no, Mr. President, there will be unrest in the Arab streets if you do this. Trump was right. The experts were wrong. And we should all note that because Trump was right.
Yeah, and they're still wrong about other things like the two-state solution, which has been tried and failed over and over and over again. Biden talks about himself as a man with new ideas. In fact, there's no older idea in the book, and yet he still seems to be trying to shove it down Israel's throat.
The real change that needs to happen in the Middle East, and this is what good could come out of the horror of October 7th. Once Hamas is destroyed and you have to rebuild Gaza, I've been to a city just on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula. It's called Sharm el-Sheikh. It's one of the most beautiful coastal resorts anybody could ever imagine. It's in Egypt. It is a thriving, peaceful community bringing in tons of revenue for the Egyptian government. Beautiful, serene. Why can't Gaza be the same thing? They're on the beautiful Mediterranean Sea. The Gaza Strip could be one of the world's most beautiful beach communities imaginable. If only people of Gaza had leaders like the leaders of the United Arab Emirates or the other Gulf Arab leaders who put the needs of their people and their economy ahead of terror. This is not unimaginable for the people of Gaza. Get rid of Hamas and then work to make this happen. There is no reason Gaza cannot be the world's next Sharm el-Sheikh. And this is how peace, long-lasting peace, is achieved. It's also how you help the people of Gaza. This is long-term help because this is what peaceful, normal nations do. They put their people first.
Yeah,
Hamas always put terrorism first.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the people in Gaza have been sold for not just the last 16 years when they were under Hamas, but for the last 75 years by UNRWA and by various Palestinian leaders that their goal is the destruction of Israel, and that's that's why Hamas seems to be still popular. Indeed, I think we know. I mean, when Mahmoud Abbas was elected president of the Palestinian Authority, when George W. Bush was still president, and he's serving in the 19th year of that 4-year term because he's afraid if he has another election, Hamas will win.
Yeah, that's it. But this is where I think in the aftermath of October 7th and of the military operation Israel's carrying out, that there is a possibility of a new beginning in Gaza. And it's important to look to what can the future of Gaza look like. Israel is not going to want to militarily occupy them forever again. And so what can come out of it? And you do have to hope and want to believe that after this is done, and after Hamas no longer is holding guns to the heads of innocents, the innocents can find their own voice and talk about the type of leadership they want in Gaza. But you first have to eradicate Hamas.
Well, I think you're right about that. And, it kind of won't happen, if you prevent Israel from finishing off Hamas. And it won't happen if the rest of the world keeps telling the Palestinians that they're victims and that Israel is a genocidal apartheid state and just wait for us to bail you out. There has to be sort of a April 1945 in Berlin realization that it's time to kill the idea that has been running their government for the last 2 decades.
And if Joe Biden is reelected, you're going to continue to have that quagmire because you're going to continue to give Hamas hope. And I think if Donald Trump is elected, he is going to be the one who can carry that message that you guys shouldn't have attacked on October 7th. Now you're getting what you deserve. Israel needs to finish the job. Hopefully the job will already have been finished way prior to November. And then Donald Trump will be the powerful backer of Israel, convincing the people of Gaza, pursue peace, stop pursuing war. It's leading to nothing but bad news for you. Pursue peace, and you can have a very bright future. Trump loves that message. That was a message he tried to pursue with North Korea, if you remember. I can see him doing the same thing in a post-war Gaza.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, we'll see. Now, Ari, you wrote an excellent book, I thought, about media bias in 2022. How would you evaluate the mainstream press coverage of October 7th and the Israel-Hamas war?
Well, I think it started out well. I think it started out with covering the horrors of October 7th. And the world was shocked, and reporters did a good job getting in and telling that story. But since then, it's been an abomination, particularly at the New York Times. I mean, they play up every piece of Palestinian sympathy, even when they're false. And if you remember at the beginning of the counteroffensive that Israel launched, there was a hospital that was hit. And the press blamed Israel for it. Israel instantly, and to Israel's credit, they're communicating better and faster. Israel instantly said, we didn't do it. That was an errant rocket that was fired from within Gaza. But the tendency of the American media is to blame Israel first. And that's what we keep seeing in all the coverage. They accept the numbers of the Palestinian Health Ministry, that more than 30,000 have been killed, instead of giving credit to Israel for the heroic efforts that they are making to avoid civilian casualties. And when you look and talk to military leaders, they'll tell you that the number of civilian casualties compared to the number of military casualties is historically low, because Israel's professional army is fighting this in the best way possible to minimize civilian deaths, particularly dealing with a Hamas that uses Palestinians as human shields. And the Western media just doesn't want to tell that story. I wish I could say why and have a simple reason for it. I think maybe I'll put the most benevolent touch on it I can. In a battle between David and Goliath, where now Israel is the Goliath, they want to come out on the side of David. And it's either that or they're just anti-Israel.
Yeah, well, I think you're right that, telling any story from the point of view of the underdog is always the easy way to do it for a journalist. But I think ideology also plays a role. I think, it's something you've discussed, the way that sort of people going into journalism, certainly in mainstream sort of corporate outlets like the Times, but not only the Times, where people buy into this idea that the purpose of journalism is activism, not the pursuit of the truth. And therefore, they think that anything that tells the story of this war from Israel's point of view, even from the victims of the slaughter on October 7th and the rapes, is somehow wrong. I'm sure you saw that whole controversy at the Times when, it took them almost 3 months to do an in-depth story about the use of rape on October 7th. And then when they did, the people in their digital media who do their podcast said they didn't want to do it because it was too pro-Israel. And then they leaked stuff to The Intercept, the left-wing publication, trashing the journalists who did the story about the rapes. And then the Times was furious and wanted to know who did the leaks. Of course, they wouldn't do that about anything else.
Right.
That seemed to me to be the, sort of tell the problem in a nutshell about how, a woke press is not, an accurate press.
The New York Times newsroom especially is a mess. There's a civil war inside that newspaper involving several of its older, more traditional reporters who really do try to adhere to the old standards of be fair in journalism, where there is a group of activists, and it's a large group of activists, mostly young, mostly progressive reporters, who think the reason you get a job at the New York Times is to change the world. And they have a direction in which they want to change the world, and it's a very liberal, progressive, left-wing direction. And it echoes all the things we talked about earlier. The fight against oppression, well, Israel's the oppressor. The fight against colonialism, well, Israel is the colonialist state. And so all of that gets meshed into their coverage of current events vis-a-vis Israel. And that's the problem the New York Times has. And they're proud of it. The other problem they have is their subscribers are overwhelmingly liberal Democrats. 6% of New York Times readers, according to the research I did for the book, identify as Republicans. So when you are editing a paper that is 94-6 in terms of its readership Democratic, you're not going to put in there things that make the 6 happy. You're going to put in there things that make the 94 happy. You're going to leave on the cutting room floor things that might be accurate that would please the 6. And you're going to tilt the news to, again, keep your subscriber base. Because you don't have advertising dollars anymore the way newspapers used to. You need to keep your subscriber base. And the New York Times has been through a number of fights in which people threatened or did drop their subscriptions because there's something too conservative, like Senator Tom Cotton's op-ed about sending in the troops during the riots in summer of 2020. The Times is not going to let that happen again because they know the economic cost. The New York Times has lost its way.
Yeah, I think you also wrote a good deal in your book about the distorted coverage of Trump. Has that changed? I think we know the answer to that, but in considering the bifurcated nature of our political and media culture, does it really matter anymore, or are both sides of the political divide just not listening to each other anymore? Something that I think is clearly evident in the surprise that Biden and the Democrats are expressing about the polls that show them losing the election when they're convinced that everything is great, or at least want us to think that they think that. And, the way that they certainly, some of the same, press outlets have been Joe Biden's bodyguards.
Yeah. Well, to me, this is the saddest thing about the breakdown of the media and the lack of trust most Americans have with the media. We as a country are stronger if we can go to one place and say, thank you for giving me the facts. Now, here's what I think of those facts. And we all believe in the same events that took place because we're factual and we were told about them. But that is no longer the case with the media. The Democrats have their media, Republicans have our media, and it's hard to find overlap about truthful events between those groups. So Democrats get their news, Republicans get their news, and we're a divided country. And I really do regret that. But the other problem the mainstream media has, and there's a Pew poll that I included in my book, there is only one group of Americans who say that the press understands people like me. And that group are college-educated Democrats. If you're a Democrat with a high school degree, you told the Pew Press polling organization that the press doesn't understand people like me. Independent voters, college degree, high school, press doesn't understand people like me, and Republicans of all stripes say that. So the New York Times and most papers now, Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS, these are college-educated Democratic reporters who are writing memos to fellow college-educated Democratic readers or viewers. That's what the media has become. And that they're stunned, absolutely stunned, when a Donald Trump can win an election, or they don't understand what's going on in America. And that's because they become this narrow ideological group of college-educated people driving around a cul-de-sac, talking to each other, and missing everybody else who's on their road.
Yeah, I think that's the way journalism is operating now, and it certainly isn't helping to bring people together. It's accentuating the divisions and making this country worse in many ways. Let me turn for a moment just to talk about Jewish life, and certainly post-October 7th. I think the October 7th attacks were, I think, a turning point in modern Jewish history in terms of the United States, an unprecedented surge in anti-Semitism. How much do you think has the shock about this changed American Jewry in terms of our understanding of our place in this country and the world? And I just, even before we get into the question of voting patterns, which I want to talk about as well, but are enough Jews willing to question their party and their desire to stay in sync with liberal fashion, to question toxic ideologies like critical race theory and intersectionality that are clearly enabling and providing sort of the engine for this surge of anti-Semitism?
Let me try to approach that on two levels, and they're a bit contradictory, but you'll understand why. On the Jewish level, on the faith level, what I hope and what I need to believe is that a people who have lasted thousands of years in the face of the worst persecution and pogroms ever, forever, will always prevail. That we will always hold our heads high, wear our Magen David, and never let anything stop us. Isn't that why Israel was created? Isn't that one of the greatest sources of pride of the American Jewish community? That we're finally in a country, America, that allows us to be free and not call ourselves Jews before we can call ourselves Americans. And I have to believe that, Jonathan. That is the story of our people. It's thousands of years old. I want it. I need it. I will believe it will last for thousands of more years just that way because of our defiant pride and because of God. At the same time, what October 7th has done is shook us and made us realize anti-Semitism threats really didn't lurk that far below the American surface, did they? No. I still think it's a distinct minority of Americans who have let these horrible views out. I still think America is overwhelmingly a tolerant, accepting country, especially toward Jews. But even if it's doubled from 2% to 4% or from 3% to 6%, it's shocking. And it's even worse on college campuses. That's where the heart of the problem lies for American Jews. And your question is, will young people especially change their views about progressives, who are often the biggest enemies of Israel and of Judaism, or will they just kind of tuck their tails? I don't know the answer to that yet. I think the progressive movement is such a threat to Judaism, mostly because there's so many young Jews who are proud adherents of the progressive movement. And it's incompatible in many ways with what we're taught as religious Jews. But modern Judaism isn't only taught a religion. There's something else to it that has nothing to do with religion. And the religion too often is liberal politics. That's one of the strains our Jewish community has always seen, isn't it?
Yeah, I think obviously, in terms of America as a whole, politics now plays the role that religion used to play in most people's lives. And for Jews, that is, sort of liberal democratic politics. But that places them in a bind because and it's not even about Israel. If you feel like you are no longer accepted in the institutions, I agree, most Americans are not anti-Semitic, but these ideologies have a stranglehold on institutions that American Jews prize: elite universities, journalism. I mean, all these sort of places where credentialed elites go are now not necessarily, friendly to Jews, and indeed quite hostile. And this has to have an effect on Jewish life. But whether it will be one, based in sort of fighting back or giving up, you're right. We don't know the answer to that question.
It just breaks my heart when I see these articles about young Jewish kids who are part of Students for Justice for Palestine. You can't be for both. How are you for both? I just don't get it. And this is where I think there's just a lot of lost souls out there who have accepted the liberal dogma, the progressive dogma that Israel is the oppressor, and that prevails. And yet they call themselves Jewish. I hope it's a very small minority. I've read enough stories about them that there are too many out there. J Street helped pave the way for all of this to be acceptable. At my alma mater, Middlebury College, after October 7th, there was a group of Jewish students who wanted to have a vigil for Israel. And they were told by the university administrators not to use the word Israel in their vigil because they need to be more inclusive. That it's a vigil for all who were affected by violence. And I received phone calls from two of the students who were distraught that they couldn't just express their feelings for Israel right after October 7th through a vigil using the words that they wanted to use because the administration wanted to change their message. What has happened to us? How can a university do this to its students? And months later, there was a vigil on campus held by a group of Palestinian students, Arab students, and nobody told them that they can't use the word Palestinian or Arab. This is the reality young people have to suffer through, and you've got to be a brave young person to fight through it. And I hope that there are many brave young people who will fight through it because that's the history of our people.
Right. Well, as someone who has been on the board of the Republican Jewish Coalition, you've been among those chasing a shift in Jewish votes for a long time. But as we both know, the liberal and non-Orthodox Jews who make up the vast majority of those who identify as Jewish in this country have never prioritized Israel or treated it as a litmus test for voting. Yet there are some signs, possibly influenced by the surge in anti-Semitism that we're discussing from the left, rather than from the traditional boogeymen on the right, that might change that. Do you think enough Jews are prepared to prioritize Israel and their shock about anti-Semitism over their beliefs about, say, abortion or their hatred for Trump to make any kind of a difference this year?
I do. I've already seen it. In 1992, George H.W. Bush got 11% of the Jewish vote when he was defeated by Bill Clinton. Bob Dole, 4 years later, got 16% of the Jewish vote. George W. Bush, 4 years later, got 19%. And when he ran for re-election, he got 25%. Mitt Romney and Donald Trump each got around 32% of the Jewish vote. So the Jewish vote has tripled for Republicans since 1992, since George H.W. Bush. I think that given what's happened October 7th, given how poorly Joe Biden has handled this, his statements that Israel is over the top, I think Senator Schumer's speech, all of this is making those who care about Israel increasingly vote Republican. I would not be surprised if the Jewish vote this time is between 35, 40, and right around 40% Republican.
So chasing that magic Ronald Reagan record for the modern record for most Jewish, highest percentage of Jewish votes that President Reagan got in 1980. You think that's in danger, or possibly in danger?
I do. I do, because Jews do vote on the basis of foreign policy more than most groups. And particularly when there is a hot shooting war that's existential for Israel, yeah, Jews are going to vote much more on the basis of foreign policy.
Yes. Well, we'll see how that turns out, and I'm sure we'll be asking you to analyze it in one way or the other. Lastly, I want to talk about something that has become, I think, a key talking point, not just for Democrats, but I think in a certain way also for Republicans in this election, and that is the question of the defense of democracy. Do you think American democracy is under threat right now? And where is that threat actually coming from? Because I think if you speak to both Republicans and Democrats, they might give you the opposite answers.
Look, I avoid these overhyped words. Our American system has always had its tensions and its pressures. What I've rejected is the effort in 2016 to delegitimize the legitimate winner of the election, Donald Trump. Do you want to go back to then and say, was that a threat to democracy when the Democrats tried to undo in the Electoral College in December of 2016 the votes for Trump? The hundreds of thousands of calls and influence campaign that was made to try to get electors to illegally shift their vote from Trump to Hillary, or to throw it into the House of Representatives? Was that a threat to democracy? Or how many times did the Democrats object to the certification of electors for George W. Bush when it came time to count the electors? I could go on, including when Colorado, Maine, and then Illinois threw Donald Trump off the ballot. Was that a threat to democracy? January 6th, was that a threat to democracy? So there are many things that people can cite, but I will tell you this about January 6th. As much as it was a riot and anybody who attacked the police deserved to be in prison, our system held. Our system held, and that same night, the certification of the electors took place. Because America's system, our Constitution, is that strong. And I will put my vote and my faith in our American Constitution any day. And so when I hear this talk about threat to democracy, I look at it the same way I look at virtually every political exaggeration word, and I put it back into context. We are a strong country.
Yeah, I want to agree with you, and I hope that we'll continue to do so. I guess given the demonization of Trump and the belief on the left, and certainly on the Jewish left, we hear a lot about this. We heard it in 2020. We're hearing it again now, that stopping him is akin to preventing Hitler from taking power in Germany in 1933. What do you think will happen in this country if he does win the election? Speaking of insurrections, and what will happen if he doesn't?
I think it'll be largely a repeat of what happened from 17 to 21. That if you like policies that actually are good, tough policies that move America forward, that are economically compassionate policies that created huge numbers of opportunities for Americans, particularly lower income Americans who gained the most during the Trump years. Income inequality shrunk under Donald Trump pre-COVID. Child poverty rate was at its lowest in recorded history under Donald Trump pre-COVID. If you care about actual results of success, and you can put up with all the extracurricular noise that Donald Trump will put out, I think America is going to be roaring. Look at what's happened in the last 4 years under Joe Biden. I mean, how much more miserable do we have to be? How much more open does the border have to be? And Jonathan, on the border, The number one reason people come to America illegally is because they see it on television and know you can do it. Those same pictures that we see here at home, you don't think they're seeing those in Guatemala or Colombia or Nigeria or in China? They see those pictures and go, look how easy it is to get in. I can go too. And they get a phone call from a relative of theirs who got in. And they said, I made it, you can too. You know what will stop that? Fear. Bipartisan legislation, that can make a difference, all that. I understand. Fear. Fear of Donald Trump. I will promise you that if Donald Trump wins, the number of people trying to get over the border is going to drop precipitously because they're going to say to themselves, I'm scared to death of this guy. He's crazy. He's not going to let us in. Biden let us in, God bless him. Trump, he says he's going to start the biggest deportation ever because he has no choice. And as soon as those flights and people see those pictures of people going the other way, that's how you close a border. So what will happen if Donald Trump is elected? A lot of noise, but a hell of a lot of good results.
Well, we will see what happens. I'll look forward. You've been a repeat guest and a great one, and we'll hope to have you back to see how all this turns out. Ari, thanks so much for joining us today and for your insights.
Thank you, and thank you for all you do. You're a brilliant writer and a great voice, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Ari. That's very kind of you to say. We want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org. Let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.